The deal was made on a gray morning when the wind carried the smell of dust and distant rain across the open fields. Folks in that small frontier town spoke in low voices about the trade, pretending not to stare, though every eye followed her as she stood near the old wooden fence with her hands folded tightly in front of her. At 18, she had hoped for something better than being exchanged like livestock, yet hope was a luxury she had never been allowed to keep for long. The man she was handed to was known only as the solitary Apache, a quiet figure who lived far from town near the rocky hills where the prairie faded into wilderness. He arrived with nothing but a horse, a bow slung across his back, and a stare that seemed to cut through every whisper around her. The horse he offered was strong and spirited, far better than anything her family had owned in years, and that alone convinced those who made the decision. They claimed it was fair, claimed it was necessary, claimed it would help everyone survive. No one asked what she wanted. Her father stood beside her with arms crossed, not out of pride, but out of fear and stubbornness. He never looked her in the eyes. He kept saying that hard times demanded hard choices, and that survival came first. She looked at his weathered boots, the cracks in the leather, the dust settled deep in each stitch, and wondered how long he had prepared himself for this moment. Hunger and drought had changed the town. Land dried up, cattle died off, and neighbors stopped helping each other the way they once did. Folks clung to what little they had, and when trouble came knocking, they pointed fingers instead of lending a hand. The horse meant work, meant travel, meant trade, meant life. She understood that. But understanding didn't make the sting any lighter. The solitary Apache stood taller than most men around him. Broad across the shoulders, his long dark hair tied back with a red cloth. His face held strength but not cruelty, though his silence made him harder to read. Rumors followed him like shadows. Some said he had lost his family during raids. Others whispered that he had left his own people because he refused to fight, choosing solitude over violence. A few believed he carried guilt deeper than anyone could carry alone. The truth remained buried, like so many secrets out on the plains. To her, he felt like a stranger, not just from another world, but from another life altogether, one she was being forced to step into without choice. When he reached out to take her hand, she noticed he didn't grip tightly. His touch was firm but calm, as if he wanted her to know he was not dragging her anywhere. She hesitated, eyes burning, chest tight, waiting for someone to call the deal off. No one did. The sun pushed through the thick clouds for a moment, lighting up the horse's coat, making the animal look almost golden against the dull grass. People shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. It was easier for them to pretend this was fate, not a decision they had helped shape. The sound of her heart felt louder than the wind, louder than the murmurs. She wondered if he heard it too. He led her away from the fence and toward the open land, walking beside her rather than in front. She didn't speak, unsure what words would matter. She thought about the life she knew, the quiet chores, the long days of washing and mending, the nights listening to her parents argue about bills and crops. She remembered dreams she never shared with anyone. Dreams of traveling beyond the plains, learning new things, seeing new towns. Instead, she was walking away from everything familiar into a world built on quiet footsteps and whispered suspicions. People feared what they didn't understand, and most of the town did not understand him. They pretended otherwise, acting like he was simply part of the land, something to tolerate, but never welcome. As they walked farther, the town sounds faded behind them. The fields opened wide, tall grass bending under the wind, birds rising from the bushes as they passed. She noticed how he looked at the land, not with ownership but with respect, as though everything around them carried meaning. He stopped once to tighten the saddle straps, and for the first time since the trade, he spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying a tone unlike the harsher voices she grew up around. He told her she could ride if she wished, or walk beside him if she preferred. He didn't order, didn't demand. It surprised her. She had been prepared for orders. She chose to walk. Time stretched on. The sky rolled with heavy clouds, promising rain that never quite fell. They reached a fork near a line of cottonwoods growing along a dry creek bed. He paused again, studying her face as if trying to understand what she feared most. She didn't know how to explain that it wasn't him she feared, but what this new life might turn her into. The world on this side of the plains was wild and untamed. Out here, there were no fences, no neighbors, no familiar voices to run to when nights grew cold. Only silence, earth, wind, and a man who carried more silence than words. Eventually, he guided her toward a narrow path leading away from the main trail. She sensed something shift then. Perhaps it was the sound of distant thunder, or the feeling that the land ahead carried stories she wasn't ready to hear. He walked slower, as if giving her time to speak, but she didn't know which question to start with. She wondered what he expected from her, whether he even wanted this arrangement, or whether the horse was worth more to him than she ever could be. When they finally reached the edge of a small ridge, she saw smoke rising from a hidden valley below. A place tucked between stones and brush where no one from the town had likely ventured. The smoke came from a fire burning near what looked like a small shelter made of wood and hides. It wasn't much, just enough for a solitary life. She realized then that his world was built on quiet work and survival, much like hers, but shaped by different scars. He stood beside her in silence, waiting for her reaction. Wind pushed her hair across her face, and she brushed it away, her breath unsteady. She tried to speak, but before any words came, the horse lifted its head and snorted, ears turning toward the valley, as if sensing something unseen. The Apache narrowed his eyes, hand drifting toward his bow, not with aggression, but caution. Something or someone moved below, but it wasn't clear who. She felt unease crawl through her chest. Knowing the trade might have placed her in the center of a conflict she didn't understand, before she could ask what waited down there. He lifted his hand gently, signaling her to stay quiet. He took one step forward, eyes locked on the movement below. The wind carried new sounds now, faint voices or footsteps, hard to tell from where. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment she wondered if the trade had been more than survival, more than a horse, more than family decisions. Maybe she wasn't just leaving her past behind. Maybe she was walking straight into someone else's unfinished story, and whatever waited in that valley would decide what her future became next. The path downhill felt tighter and more hidden than any she had ever taken. Every step made the air seem heavier, and the silence between them grew tense. The Apache walked a little ahead, moving with quiet certainty, as if every stone and shadow had been part of his life for years. He kept glancing back at her, checking that she followed, not dragging her, but guiding her with calm patience. She clutched her shawl closer around her shoulders, the wind tugging at the corners like a warning not to go farther. Yet her feet kept moving, pulled by fear and curiosity all at once. She tried to steady her breath, but uncertainty made her chest feel tight. The people in town knew little about the Apache ways. They called them dangerous, unpredictable, and wild. Over the years, stories turned into excuses for treating them as outsiders. Folks believed anything different was something to fear. Now, she was following a man they had judged without ever understanding. She wondered if they were wrong about him, if he was more human than any of them dared to admit. She looked at his back, the bow resting against his shoulder, the steady steps that never faltered. He didn't move like a monster. He moved like someone who had survived too much already. The valley below opened wide as they reached the bottom. The ground was softer there, sheltered by rock walls and twisting brush that kept the wind from stealing warmth. Smoke curled from a fire pit where a pot hung, gently bubbling with whatever stew he had prepared before riding into town. The shelter stood off to the side, sturdy and neat. It's not like a temporary camp, but a home built by hands that respected the land. 2 horses grazed near a cluster of tall grass, heads low and bodies relaxed. He paused near the fire, letting her take in the sight. She folded her arms as though trying to hold herself together. Everything here was so different. There were no fences, no dusty barns, no loud voices. She didn't know whether to feel safe or trapped. The Apache finally spoke, telling her she could sit by the fire and warm herself. His voice held no coldness, only a calm tone that made her shoulders loosen a little. She sat slowly, unsure of where she belonged in this new space. He moved quietly around the shelter, bringing out a wooden cup and a strip of cured meat. He handed them to her, and then sat on the ground a short distance away. She thanked him in a soft voice. He nodded without meeting her eyes for long, as if he didn't want to frighten her. They ate in silence, the stew bubbling and sending warm scents into the cool evening air. Coyotes called faintly in the distance, their cries echoing off the rocks. As she ate, she studied him, hoping to see clues about the life she was joining. His hands were scarred, not from carelessness, but from hard work. The leather band around his wrist looked old, worn by years of use. He held himself like a man who didn't waste movements, who understood quiet strength. She noticed how his gaze occasionally drifted to the ridge above, toward the direction they had come, as if expecting someone to appear. After a few minutes, she gathered courage to ask him why he lived alone. At first he didn't answer. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the darkening sky. He finally said that where he once lived, he had family and a community that cared for him. But war had changed everything. He had left to protect those he loved from further harm. Solitude was the price he paid to keep peace. His words were simple, yet heavy with meanings she could not fully grasp. She asked if he had wanted her in exchange for the horse. The question slipped out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a long moment, eyes steady and deep, then shook his head. He told her he offered the horse to help her family survive, never thinking they would demand anything in return. They insisted she come with him. He could have refused, but he feared what might have happened to her if he had. The town held too much anger, too many cold hearts. He believed she was safer here, even if she didn't understand it yet. His answer made something inside her shift. She had pictured him as the one who wanted this trade, yet he sounded like the only person who wished it never happened. Her father's face came rushing back in her mind, stern and cold, acting like he had made the only choice. She had tried to believe him. Now that belief started to crumble. The sky dimmed as clouds thickened overhead, turning the valley colder. The Apache stood and walked toward the horses, checking their reins. She watched him quietly, still unsure of her place. The warning from earlier lingered. Those distant sounds she heard along the ridge hadn't been imagination. Someone or something had followed them. She asked him if danger waited beyond those rocks. He answered that danger always waited somewhere. But he didn't seem afraid. He seemed ready. Night took hold, and he guided her inside the shelter, telling her she should rest. It was small, but neat, with a simple bed of blankets and a woven mat laid on the ground. He lit a small lantern and placed it near her before stepping outside again. The thin walls let in the sound of the wind shifting through the brush. She could hear him settling just beyond, keeping watch. She lay awake, staring at the roof as shadows danced. Every thought about her old life turned into doubt. Why had no one tried to stop this trade for good? Why had they looked away when she begged them with her eyes? She realized that she didn't belong there any more than she belonged here. She was caught between two worlds, both claiming survival while forgetting compassion. The weight of that truth pressed hard on her. Tears welled up, but she wiped them away quickly. Crying changed nothing. She needed strength she wasn't sure she had. Half asleep, she heard movement outside. Quiet footsteps. The Apache stood alert, his bow in hand. Voices whispered from the darkness beyond the firelight. They sounded like men, low and cautious. She sat up, heart pounding. He signaled her to stay back, positioning himself between the shelter and the unknown threat. His stance was calm but prepared, eyes wide and steady. The whispers turned to harsh mutters. Someone stepped closer, gravel crunching under boots. Then a man's voice cut through the night, accusing the Apache of stealing from white folks. Anger dripped from his words like poison. She recognized that voice. It came from the town, from someone who had always looked at the Apache. With hate and distrust, her breath hitched as she realized this wasn't coincidence. Those men had followed them. They wanted the horse, or maybe they wanted revenge for a deal they pretended to approve. She peered through the small opening in the shelter wall. She counted 3 figures in the shadows, guns glinting under the lantern's faint light. The Apache spoke from his place near the fire, telling them calmly he had taken nothing, that the trade was fair and witnessed by all. The men didn't care about fairness. In their eyes, giving anything valuable to an Apache was wrong. They believed he didn't deserve it. They believed she didn't deserve freedom either. Her heart hammered. She wanted to shout the truth, to tell them to leave, but fear froze her tongue. The fire crackled again, soft glow catching the tension in every line of the Apache's body. One of the men stepped even closer. His voice rose, threatening violence if the horse wasn't handed back. The Apache didn't move. His silence was stronger than any argument. But silence couldn't stop a bullet. The valley seemed to hold its breath. The night waited for what came next. She pressed her hand over her mouth, praying he wouldn't face them alone. But no prayer could erase the truth. Her new life was beginning with danger. And the worst part was she didn't know if she was the reason for it. The man in front raised his gun a little higher, not pointing it directly, but close enough that the warning was clear. The Apache stood with his bow lowered, not because he lacked strength, but because he understood how quickly a fight could spiral beyond control. The fire crackled between them, casting uneven shadows across tense faces. She stayed hidden inside the shelter, fingers pressed against the rough wood. Watching the scene unfold through a small gap, her pulse was loud in her ears, drowning out the faint wind moving through the valley. One of the men shifted his stance, impatience turning into something sharper. He accused the Apache of taking advantage of her family's hardship and demanded that she return to town with them. The Apache replied that she was free to choose her own path, and he would not hold her against her will. His voice sounded calm, but the air around him felt heavy with unspoken history. She wanted to call out, to tell the men the truth, that she had been given away, not taken. Yet fear anchored her in silence. The men didn't come for her out of concern. They had laughed when she walked away that morning. Now their eyes burned with resentment because the horse stood tall beside the fire, strong and well-fed, a prize worth fighting for. They only came once they realized what they had lost. She realized they were not angry at the Apache for receiving her. They were angry because he had received value they felt belonged to them. The Apache finally stepped back a few paces, giving the men space. He understood aggression only fueled flames. But that small gesture was mistaken for weakness. The man with the raised gun sneered and shouted that someone like him had no right to own a horse better than what most white ranchers had. The words struck her like a slap. The horse was never the real issue. Pride, power, and prejudice had been waiting beneath the surface. She watched the man's finger twitch on the trigger. The Apache noticed too. His eyes narrowed, not in fear, but calculation. Before tension snapped, another figure stepped from the brush on the far side of the fire. Not a friend from town, and not one of the intruders. A woman. Older, wrapped in a blanket, hair braided in long dark strands that matched the Apache's. Her face carried quiet strength and an unspoken warning. The men stumbled back, startled by her sudden appearance. She said nothing, just stared at them with fierce eyes. The Apache seemed to know her, though he didn't speak at first. She stood beside him like someone who had carried loss and learned how to wear it without breaking. Her arrival thickened the atmosphere. The men weren't prepared to face more than one person, especially someone who wasn't afraid of them. She finally spoke. Telling the men to leave, or risk turning these rocks into a graveyard of foolish pride. Her tone held no threats, only truth. The men hesitated, looking at each other, unsure whether they wanted to test her resolve. After a long breath, they stepped back, muttering curses and empty threats, promising they would return with more men. Then they disappeared into the darkness, their boots fading into the night. The fire's crackle returned as the loudest sound in the valley. She loosened her grip on the shelter wall, her hands shaking from the weight of everything she had witnessed. The Apache lowered his bow, shoulders tense but steady. The woman beside him remained still, keeping her gaze fixed on the direction the men had gone until she was sure they wouldn't return that night. Only then did she turn toward the shelter. The Apache gestured for her to step out. She hesitated, then climbed out slowly, unsure if the woman would welcome her or see her as a burden. The woman's expression softened only slightly, offering neither anger nor warmth. She simply studied her like someone measuring the truth of her presence. The Apache introduced the woman in a quiet tone, explaining that she lived farther up the valley, watching over the land from a distance. She was not his mother, though she had once been close to his family. She carried the memories of people he had lost. As they settled back near the fire, the woman revealed that she had seen riders earlier, men who followed their trail with uneasy intentions. She had come not out of curiosity, but to protect what remained of her community, fractured though it was. She warned that the town wouldn't let the issue rest. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke of past fights between their people and settlers. Too much blood, too many graves, too many reasons for fear to grow. She sat beside the fire while the Apache handed her fresh water. None of them spoke for a while. The wind grew colder, and clouds broke apart, revealing a thin slice of moon. The woman studied the girl again, asking why she followed the Apache so willingly. She tried to explain, but the words tangled in her chest. How could she describe a life where survival meant swallowing pride and obeying choices made by others? How could she explain shame that did not belong to her, but clung to her all the same? She finally said she had nowhere else to go. The woman understood that answer too well. Survival often left no room for pride. Later, when they prepared to sleep, the Apache told her she would rest inside while he stayed outside to watch. The woman remained too, sharing silent company as guardians of the valley. She curled under the blankets, listening to faint murmurs of their voices outside. Exhaustion pulled her under, but even sleep didn't bring peace. She dreamed of hooves pounding across the prairie, of angry voices in the wind, of families turning their backs. Morning came gently, with sunlight spilling across the valley. She opened her eyes to find the Apache tending the fire, his face calm but tired. The woman was gone, leaving no trace except a few footprints near the embers. He didn't explain where she went, only said she returned to her own place. He offered breakfast, and they ate quietly again. Something had changed in the way he glanced at her now. He seemed more cautious, not toward her, but toward the world surrounding her presence. They spent most of the morning gathering wood and water. She tried helping, but her hands were unsteady, and he guided her with patient instructions. As she worked, she noticed scratches on the rocks that looked like old weapon marks. She asked him if battles had happened here. He nodded, saying the valley had once been a hiding place for those fleeing conflict. Families had sheltered here when soldiers drove people from their homes. Some survived, others didn't. The land remembered what humans tried to forget as the day stretched on. They climbed up the ridge to scout the area. Tracks from the previous night still marked the soil. The men had circled back before leaving, trying to find another route in. She realized the valley wasn't just isolated, it was a sanctuary. A secret place that held stories older than any town ledger. She asked him what he planned to do now that the men threatened to return. He didn't answer right away. He looked out over the plains, eyes narrowed, breathing slow. He finally said that running solved nothing. The town would always fear what they didn't understand. He wouldn't hide, but he wouldn't invite war either. He would prepare, watch, and wait. She felt the weight of those words settle on her heart. Her presence here wasn't the beginning of peace. It was the spark that could ignite new conflict. The thought stung. She wondered if she should leave, return to the town before trouble deepened. The Apache sensed her hesitation and told her she could return any time. He wouldn't stop her. He only asked that if she went by her own choice, not because of fear woven by others. His words left her torn. Leaving meant safety, but also surrender. Staying meant facing whatever storms came as they stood on the ridge. The wind carried faint, distant sounds, hooves, not thunderous yet, but growing. Riders were coming, moving fast across the plains. She felt her breath catch, eyes widening as dust lifted near the horizon. This time, it wasn't just 3 men. More shadows followed, and they weren't slowing down. The dust clouds rose thicker as the riders advanced, turning the horizon into a blurry wave of motion and intent. She stood beside the Apache on the ridge, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might echo through the valley. The wind carried faint shouts, the kind of voices fueled by anger rather than reason. The Apache watched them without blinking, his stance solid, his jaw tight. He wasn't afraid, but he was no longer calm either. He counted riders under his breath, measuring distance and time. He knew the land well enough to predict their path, but even he couldn't ignore how many were coming. She wrapped her arms around herself. Feeling the cold rise from her bones, even though the sun burned across the plains, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder, not to command her, but to ground her. He said they still had time before the riders reached the valley, but not much. She asked if they should flee deeper into the hills. He shook his head. Running too early would only make them look guilty. Standing still invited danger. The narrow line between the two was becoming harder to walk. He led her back down the ridge in quick strides, moving toward the shelter. She kept close, her steps crunching in the dry brush. The valley felt different now. No longer a safe hiding place, but a trap, with only two ways in or out. He gathered the horses and checked the bowstring, then grabbed a worn spear hidden under a flat stone. She noticed his hands shake slightly, not from fear, but from the heavy weight of choices pressing on him. She wanted to help, but didn't know how. Her entire life, she had done chores for survival, not stood in front of danger with choice in her own hands. The Apache told her she wasn't a burden, and that what came next was not her fault. His words brought warmth, but they also brought guilt. She refused to stand by without doing something. Before they could plan further, someone approached from the tree line. The older woman from the night before returned, breathless from moving quickly across the uneven ground. She held a bundle wrapped in cloth, filled with herbs, dried roots, and carved stones marked with symbols. These weren't weapons, but tools for guidance and healing. She warned that the riders were not just angry. They were being pushed by someone who wanted to fight, someone who could twist fear into purpose. She didn't speak the name, but the way her voice shook suggested there was a deeper history behind the threat. The Apache asked her if she would stay. The woman nodded. She had lost too much to stay silent now. Together they stood at the center of the valley, the fire smoldering behind them, the land holding its breath. The wind whispered through the grass, as if readying the earth for what was coming. As minutes passed, the distant hoofbeats grew louder. She tried to steady her breathing, but couldn't. Everything she thought she understood about herself felt small beside this growing storm. She remembered how the town avoided helping her family, how bitterness had settled into every household. If people could turn cold toward their own, what would they do to someone they had always treated as an outsider? She caught sight of the Apache tightening ropes along the ridge, not to block the riders, but to create a path that slowed their advance. He knew the land well enough to control how others moved across it. He didn't want bloodshed, but he also refused to be cornered. The older woman helped her scatter herbs along the entrance of the valley, the air filled with sharp scents that carried meanings she did not fully understand. The Apache watched her work and explained those herbs were once used to protect families during dark times. They did not keep danger away, but reminded people of the cost of violence. She listened, feeling a strange comfort in ancient traditions she was only beginning to learn. The riders finally reached the outer ridge, their shadows long under the afternoon sun. There were more than a dozen, all armed, faces stern and restless. Some she recognized from town, men who rarely spoke to her unless they needed help. Now they looked at her with something colder, as if her presence among the Apache had marked her as traitor. The leader rode forward, glaring down into the valley. He shouted that the Apache had stolen land, livestock, and now a young woman. He demanded they surrender and return everything to its rightful place. Her cheeks burned as she stepped forward, shouting back that she had not been stolen. She said she had been traded away by her own family, and they had chosen a horse over her future. The men shifted in their saddles, uneasy with the truth. Some glanced at each other, unsure whether to believe her. The leader ignored her completely, raising his rifle higher. His eyes were fixed on the Apache, not her. The Apache stepped ahead of her, placing himself between her and the rifles above. He called out that he would not fight unless they attacked first. He reminded them he had done nothing wrong. The leader snapped back that a man like him had no right to decide what was wrong or right. He spat words filled with old grudges, calling the Apache a threat, calling the valley stolen land. His tone made it clear he had waited a long time for an excuse like this. Before the men could fire a shot, another sound echoed across the plains. hoofbeats from the opposite side. A smaller group approached, riding slowly but with purpose. Not from town, not from the valley, riders who seemed to know the Apache. The older woman stiffened, whispering that they were kin, drawn by signs she had sent earlier. She had not called them to fight, but to witness. Family returning after years apart, the town riders grew tense at the sight. They wanted a fight until they realized they might be outnumbered. The air crackled with risk, every hand near a trigger or bowstring. The Apache looked between both groups, his eyes filled with memories and wounds that ran deeper than anything she had known. His past and present had collided on the same stretch of ground. And she stood beside him at the center. The leader from town demanded the newcomers leave. One of the returning riders stepped forward, older than the Apache, but carrying the same quiet strength. He spoke calmly, saying this land was not a battleground for other men's pride. He said the girl had chosen to stay, and that choice should end the argument. The leader scoffed, saying choices only mattered when made by the right kind of people. His words stirred anger in her chest. She stepped forward again, shaking but firm. She said she would not return to a place that traded her away. She said she would not be owned by anyone. The valley fell silent after her words. Even the wind paused, but silence did not erase danger. The leader raised his gun again, pointing it directly at the Apache this time. His horse shifted under him, restless, sensing tension. The Apache stood still, not reaching for his bow. He waited for the man to decide whether pride was worth spilling blood. The girl stared at the man, wondering if one pull of a trigger would end everything she had barely begun to understand. Her throat tightened, but she didn't back away. The older woman stepped closer, placing a hand on her arm, steadying her. The Apache's kin moved quietly behind him, ready to defend him if needed. The town riders tightened their grips, ready to strike. The leader's finger curled around the trigger. The valley held its breath, and the moment before the shot was fired felt like the edge between two worlds, where fate balanced on steel and silence. The gun trembled in the man's grasp, not from wind or weight, but from the uneasy battle inside him. He had come ready to prove something, ready to return to town as the man who stood up to the Apache. But now, the valley watched him from all sides. The Apache stood tall without raising a weapon. The girl stood beside him, not hiding behind him, but sharing the ground he protected. The returning riders watched in silence, steady and calm, not threatening, but ready. The moment stretched until his pride began to crack. His horse shifted again, nearly throwing him off balance. He looked at the girl, then back at the Apache, but the fire in his anger had dimmed. No one shouted. No weapon rose against him. The power he expected to have slipped from his hands. With a frustrated curse, he lowered the rifle and turned away, signaling the others to pull back. They left in uneven lines, no longer speaking with one voice, scattering across the ridge like men unsure of what they stood for in the first place. When the dust settled and the last hoofbeat faded, silence returned to the valley. The girl let out a shaking breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her knees felt weak, but she stayed standing. The Apache lowered his bow, exhaling slowly, as though letting go of a burden he had carried far too long. The older woman placed a hand on his wrist, steadying his spirit without saying a word. The returning riders moved closer, greeting him with quiet nods and long overdue embraces. The kind given when there is too much pain to speak about. One of them approached the girl and thanked her for standing with him when others would have run. She didn't know how to respond. She had never been thanked for simply existing. The Apache watched her with tired eyes, grateful in a way that didn't rely on words. They returned to the shelter as late afternoon softened into evening. The fire burned low, casting a warm glow around them. The riders sat in a circle, sharing dried meat and water. They spoke of old times, of families gone and new lives built far from familiar lands. The girl listened, learning pieces of their history. She saw how much had been lost, not because people were different, but because fear had been louder than understanding. Later, when the riders prepared to leave again, the older man who had spoken earlier placed a hand on the Apache's shoulder. He said he had spent years believing solitude might heal old wounds, but now he saw that staying apart had only kept them open. He urged the Apache to return someday, not to fight, but to live among those who still remembered him. The Apache didn't answer immediately, but the idea settled in his eyes like a spark waiting to grow. The woman and the girl stayed by the fire as the riders rode out beneath the fading sky. She watched them disappear toward the distant hills and felt a shift inside her. This land, which once felt frightening and wild, now felt like part of something bigger than just survival. It held memories, hopes, and new beginnings. Night crept in quietly. Stars appeared one by one like lanterns over the plains. She sat near the fire, pulling the blanket closer as the air cooled. The Apache joined her, sitting close but not crowding her. They watched the flames together without speaking. Sometimes silence said more than words. After a long while, he told her she could return to town if she wished. He said the danger had passed and no one would stop her. He promised to help her find a home or a safe place if she chose to leave. She stared at the fire, remembering her family's faces. The cold choices they made, the way she was handed away like a traded item. She knew she could return, and life might continue as if nothing had happened. But she also knew leaving would mean stepping back into a world that had never truly seen her. She looked at him, at the steady way he carried every scar and memory. She thought of the valley, the quiet mornings, the strength she had found in standing up for herself. She whispered that she didn't want to go back. She wanted to build a life where she was not someone's burden or bargaining piece. She wanted to stay where she mattered by choice, not by force. The Apache listened without interrupting. He didn't look surprised, only humbled. He told her she could stay, not as payment for a horse, not as something traded away, but as someone choosing her own path. His voice carried no claim over her life, only respect. Days passed after that, each one calmer than the last. She learned how to help with gathering wood, how to tend to the horses, how to read the changing sky. The older woman visited often, teaching her which roots soothed pain and which plants warned of storms. The Apache repaired old arrows, fixed fences, and slowly allowed pieces of his past to surface. She shared her own memories, too, letting them fade into something less heavy each time she spoke. The town kept its distance. The men who rode out that day avoided looking her way when trading near the hills. Some whispered apologies they never dared speak aloud. Others stayed bitter, but their anger no longer had power over her life. The valley had become more than a hiding place. It was a beginning. Months later, when spring warmed the plains and wildflowers covered the ground, she walked to the ridge alone at dawn. The wind brushed her face gently, carrying the scent of new grass. She looked out over the open land and felt something she had never felt before. Not fear, not confusion, belonging, a future shaped by her own choices. The Apache joined her, standing beside her with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He told her a new shelter would be built soon, one large enough for more than solitude. He wasn't building it for her or for himself alone. He was building it for a life shared, rooted in respect and trust. She smiled as the sunlight climbed over the hills. Warming the soil beneath their feet, she reached for his hand, and he held hers gently, as if recognizing how far both of them had come. They stood in silence, watching the world wake below them. Whatever hardships waited ahead, they would face them together. The girl who had been traded away was gone. In her place stood someone who had found her home. Her voice and her worth beside a solitary Apache who no longer walked the world alone.